This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Hello, everybody. Very lovely to see you all. So, we've been looking at the 6 paramitars in this series. We've been looking at sometimes called the 6 perfections. I don't actually like that translation very much. Perfection sounds a bit off-putting somehow. But you can also translate them as the 6 ways of transcending, the 6 ways beyond, the 6 ways of transcending our present, small, limited self, 6 ways of, if you like, stepping out of the stuffy little cage we're in into a much wider and more beautiful world, an expansive world. So we've been exploring these 6 practices by looking at an 8th century text called the Bodhicharya Avatara, which it means the guide to the path of awakening, written by a monk called Shantideva. And this isn't just a sort of Ramsden whimsy on our part to use this text, because in terms of traditional canonical texts, Shantideva's work is the authorized textbook. It's the guide to the Bodhisattva path. It's an extremely important text. It was the first text that our founder, Sangharakshita, led study on when he came back to the UK and founded our order. And he has said that all order members should be familiar with it. The Dalai Lama says that it is his main inspiration and that he reads it every day. So it's aptly named the guide to the path of the aspiring bodhisattva, the path of the 6 paramitars. In most of the text of Bodhicharya Avatara consists of a chapter on one each of the paramitars. So we heard about the practice of giving, generosity. We've heard about the practice of ethics, which Shantideva mainly talks about in terms of mindfulness, because mindfulness underlies all the others. You can't really practice the other precepts unless you're mindful, as I think that's why it often wins the great debate about which is the most important precept. We've heard about the 3rd and 4th paramitar, Shanti and Virya, which can't really be translated in a single word into English, but which often get translated as patience and energy. Then we focused on the 5th paramitar for several weeks, meditation. And now we have reached the culmination, the chapter on wisdom, the transcendent vision, that if we achieve it, will be like us turning from a grub into a butterfly and flying away. The vision it's like the frog getting out of its well into a vast space and seeing the sky and the ocean. So in this chapter, we are about to be told the secret of life, the universe, and everything in your dreams. It's often said that Shantideva's chapter on wisdom is completely incomprehensible. Much of it seems to consist of Shantideva arguing with other people who've got philosophical viewpoints that he doesn't agree with and which he thinks might be harmful. But because we've got no idea what those viewpoints were, we've got no idea what he was trying to refute. So what he says doesn't mean anything to us. To us, the chapter is just gobbledygook. So I'm off home. Well, actually not. Actually, it's not quite that bad. A lot of the wisdom chapter does seem to be completely opaque. You just bang your head on it and think, what on earth? But we can pick out parts that make perfect sense, even to us, even after all these years. I've had a go at doing that in the edited version of the Bodhicharya Avatara that you can find online as part of the wisdom course. It does include some of the chapter on wisdom, the bits that made any sense to me, basically. So if you feel moved to, you can find that online. And there are a lot of other chapters in the book, in the Bodhicharya Avatara, that shine a light on the vision that Shantideva is trying to express. So this talk is entitled Limbs of the Universe, I believe. And this is a reference to part of Shantideva's chapter actually on meditation rather than wisdom, where he says, Just as I love and cherish my body, which is divided into many limbs, so I should love and cherish this whole world, which is divided into many beings. Just as I love and cherish my body, which is divided into many limbs, so I should love and cherish the whole world, which is divided into many beings. Shantideva's whole text, if you like, is based on a vision of the universe as, if you like, a single being of which we are part. We are limbs. And with that vision, it makes no more sense for us to just focus on our own well-being than it would be for our hand to just look after the hand and not look after the rest of us. So at one point he asked, does my hand refuse to remove a thorn from my foot because the hand is not the foot? We're all limbs of the universe and we should all help each other, is the point he's making, just as the limbs of a single body, our body, help each other. So with this vision of the universe as a single being, our sense of being separate from others and the world around us comes to be seen as an illusion that causes us really big suffering and blinds us to the real beauty and wonder of things. So in his final dedication in the book, Shantideva expresses the hope that we'll all eventually see that for ourselves, that we'll see ourselves as limbs of the universe. So he says, may the universe attain Buddhahood in a single divine body. So he's expressing this vision of the universe as this whole being, if you like. So this vision of wholeness and connectedness that Shantideva expresses is the other side of the teaching of Anatman. It's the other side of the coin. Anatman, one of the three lakshanas that you've heard about in the last week of the introductory course. And Anatman is often translated as non-self. And it's often talked about as seeing Anatman is seeing that we don't have a self. But that's actually a misunderstanding. And it can be very harmful if taken literally. Anatman is a sort of an idea that was around in Indian philosophy and may well still be, of us having a completely untouchable, Teflon-coated essence that is so that we're completely independent. There's part of us that's completely independent of the world around us and completely unchanging. Totally independent, totally unchanging. And apparently there was a sort of idea that that would be the only sort of self worth having. So it gets equated, Atman gets equated with self. So Anatman often translated as no self, which could be a very negative teaching, and I'll come back to that, but it's often translated as no self. But we do have a self. We have a self, but it is a self which is constantly changing and constantly affected by conditions, deeply interwoven with the world around us. We exist in relationship to the world around us, not as some sort of Teflon-coated thing in itself. So we don't have an Atman, we don't have an unchanging essence, but we do have a self. You are different from me. You have your own unique being, as I do, and we have to look after this unique being. We've got a self, and we need to look after this self, although it's a changing self. We need to encourage it to change in positive ways using the law of karma. One of the sort of terrible fallacies of the no-self doctrine can be, well, if I'm not the same person, if there's no me, how can there be a law of karma? Which is absolute suicide. But we need to work to benefit this self, to change it in positive ways by using that changeability, using the law of karma to change in positive directions, and using the fact that we're interdependent So we put ourselves in circumstances that help us to develop in a positive direction. So, and that man is not self, okay? And taking that idea that we do not have a self literally can have some really dangerous and negative consequences. It can be very negative, very nihilistic. It can leave us living in a dark, meaningless world if we don't understand it. I've even known people who've said, well, I don't have a self, so I have no power of choice. I have no free will. I'm just totally a creature of conditions, so I just go with the flow. I can't make ethical choices. Well, I'll just watch the telly. And I do know people who have committed that form of spiritual suicide on the basis of a wrong understanding of no self, or perhaps they just didn't want to practice the Dharma. I'm not sure. But it could be a very negative place to think, well, there's no self, so it's just like I'm part of this big machine. It's all very nihilistic. But what this teaching is getting at is, in fact, highly positive. It's getting at the fact that we are not lonely, isolated individuals in a hostile world, sort of stuck as little islands in a hostile world, all cut off from each other and cut off from the world, which is against us. But in fact, we are profoundly interconnected with others and the world around us, which is a much more interesting way to exist. So we exist in our relationships. We are related, we are our relationships. There's no sort of essence. We are our relationships. And to be a standalone, unconnected, unchanging being, like an Atman, would in fact be a terrible, cold, isolated existence. And very boring, because nothing would ever change. So yeah, it's not a negative teaching. It's a highly positive teaching, or it's trying to open us up. It's pointing the way to a really liberating and positive way of seeing things. And it underlies the whole of sort of Shantideva's approach in his book. And traditionally, there are said to be three aspects to the teachings that Shantideva gives us in his great work. So, which could be, they've called various things, but they could be called vision, first of all. Vision, the sort of head aspect, the understanding aspect. And then attitude, which we could say is the heart aspect. It's like, what is the attitude with which I live my life? And then action. So what do I actually do to express that attitude and develop that vision? We could say it's head, heart, and guts, head, heart, and body. Real wisdom, real insight, what we very misleadingly called insight, because that sounds very cognitive, involves the whole being, involves the whole of us, head, heart, and everything. It's a transformation of the whole being, and we need to work on all three of these aspects to move towards it. It's not just enough to just focus on the head aspect, which I think is a mistake that maybe is all too common in sort of Western Buddhism. But the head aspect is important. And it's, of course, what mainly the chapter is about. We need to get an intellectual grasp of what is meant here, of what it means, what Anatman means, what conditioned co-production means, which is sort of very related to Anatman. It's the same thing. We need to grasp what it's really getting at, and that way of seeing things, that way of thinking about things. We need to soak ourselves in it over time, so that it sort of sinks in. It sort of starts to colour our bones, and so it affects the way we act in the world. So we're talking about wisdom, so let's look at the vision aspect first, okay? As I've said, it's the vision of interconnectedness and interdependence, rather than being stuck and separate, and rather than being separate from the world around us and other beings. And it's the other side of seeing the truth of an Atman. We see that we don't have this independent, unchanging essence, this Atman. Or we could say we see that we are limbs of the universe. The universe is a single being, and we're all limbs in this interconnected universe. So in his chapter on wisdom, buried among all the completely incomprehensible attempts to refute other viewpoints that we don't know what they are, Shantideva takes several different approaches to convincing us, to convincing our intellect of the reality of an Atman. So he tells us, first of all, one of the things he tells us is that all things are dependent on an infinite number of conditions and causes for their existence, and they're held in place by those conditions. So nothing has independent existence. Nothing is an independent thing in itself. It's easy enough. It's easy enough to appreciate. It's almost like incontrovertible. One way we sometimes do that is to say, look at all the things and conditions that have to exist for this lectern to exist, say. It's been created from a tree, which depended on the sun, depended on the rain, which depends on the weather systems and the oceans, and the whole planet, really, and the soil, the whole ecosystem it was a part of, and everything that feeds into that ecosystem. It depends on the person who made it. And all the people responsible for training that person or giving them an apprenticeship, and the people responsible for training the people who trained that person, and the food he eats and has kept him going, and all the people who've grown that food, and all the people who ate the food, all the people who trained him and the food they ate, and all the and his parents and the food they ate, and the education they got, and the society they lived in, and their parents, and we keep going outward and outward and outward and backward in time to infinity. And we see that, well, you can hardly call this lectern a thing in itself. It's just this appearance that's sort of currently there, dependent on all these conditions, and eventually it will be something completely different. The lectern depends on everything. Without everything, this lectern wouldn't exist. And without everything, you and I wouldn't exist. How can we think of ourselves, lecterns or ourselves, as standalone things in themselves, individuals? So that's one way. Another way that Shantideva tries to convince us is what we might call the analytical method. So he says, we're like the trunk of a banana tree. I don't know if you've ever cut down a banana tree. I personally haven't. But apparently, if you cut down a banana tree, what you find is that what we think of as a trunk is just a whole load of sheaves of just leaves wrapped around each other. So you can strip the leaves away looking for the trunk of the banana tree, and there's no trunk. And he says, we are like this. We are like this. You can strip the bits of us away, our muscles, our bones, our organs, and you will never find this essential self. You will never find this essential self. You can look at our mental state. You'll never find this essential self, this thing that we think we are. Who am I to criticize Shantideva? I find that particular argument completely unconvincing. The first thing I remember being taught when I studied plant biology is that an organism or an ecosystem is more than the sum of its parts. You put the sum of parts together and things arise, things emerge which you could never have predicted from looking at the separate bits. You could not predict that Shakespeare would write his plays by looking at Shakespeare's heart and his guts and his liver and his brain. When these came together, in a particular set of circumstances, something completely new and surprising emerged. Some completely new and surprising qualities emerged that were no way predictable from any of the parts. And that depended on him being there, if he'd been there 100 years earlier, 100 years later, or if mother had been different, everything. It all came together, and all his organs and him came together to create this unique individual who could write those plays. For me, this is an example of trying to prove something that is self-evidently true by using really dodgy logic. That's as close to blasphemy as you can get in Buddhism, probably. I didn't say the Buddha said it, so maybe it's all right. And actually, there's quite a few examples of this, I think, where it's called logical ways of proving something. I better not go into any of that. Okay. Shantideva also uses the obvious truth of impermanence. He uses the obvious truth of impermanence as a way of getting us to see an Atman. So one example of this is stuck onto this lectern. It says, "This stream of mental moments I call my mind, these ever-changing elements I call my body, are not some separate thing that exists in its own right." There it is. If we are constantly changing, which we obviously are, how can we think we have some sort of unchanging essence that defines us? I am not the same person I was when I was a child or a teenager, and neither are you. And we'll both be different in the future. We'll all be different in the future. In fact, we're different from the people we were yesterday. Well, there's some different molecules in our body because our body is a process that's constantly taking things in and giving things out. So we got a different body from yesterday. And our bodies are a process, not a thing. And yesterday, perhaps we were good-natured and happy. But today, something we didn't like has happened, and we are feeling bad-tempered and grumpy. We are not the same person that we were yesterday. There is a saying that you can't step into the same river twice. And giving the river a name does not mean it has any real existence separate from the ever-changing water and the banks, etc., etc. Sometimes you get into this thing of what's the real headwater of, say, the River Don. How ridiculous is that? The River Don doesn't exist. The River Don's just part of everything. It's part of the hills. It's part of no. It's got no existence in its own right. We can't step into the same river twice, and we're not the same 2 times running. You can't see Pranafridaya twice and be dealing with quite the same person, or me. So yet another way of approaching an Atman is, and connecting us, is to see that we're not separate from the larger world around us, that we're part of a larger world. So we use this method in a meditation called the 6-element practice that people do when they're getting ready for ordination, when they're moving towards ordination. So 6 elements, they're not elements as chemists would understand them these days. They're basically the states of matter. So solid matter, liquid matter, gaseous matter, and energy, plus space, the sort of arena in which they're moving about, and consciousness, finally, consciousness. So in that practice, we reflect that there's some earth in my body, solid matter, bones and muscles and things. And we reflect that that exists in the outside world as well. There's earth, solid matter in the outside world. We reflect that we're constantly taking it in from the outside world, constantly giving it back to the outside world. There is no difference between the earth element in our body and the earth element in the outer world. So it's not our element, it's not our earth. Our bones aren't ours. They're just part of this big process. And we try and just give it back. We give that element back to the universe. And we do that with the water in our body, which is more obviously we're taking it in, we're giving it out. It's part of this big cycle of water movement in the planet. Air, constantly taking it in, giving it out. Energy, we eat our food, it turns into energy, we run around. We reflect on all this and we see that none of these is ours. None of these is ours. And we practice the idea of giving it back. And this really bites when we get to consciousness. For ages, I thought, consciousness is completely different. Consciousness is completely different. Until I was in an order retreat and somebody led this practice. And what they led it as is, well, it's not any more than the earth element and the fire element and everything is mine. It's not my consciousness. The earth element is the world's earth element. It's not my consciousness any more than the earth in my body is my earth. Let go of the idea that it's my consciousness and see it as the consciousness of the universe. See it as the consciousness of the universe looking at things from the perspective of this particular body in this particular time and space. So that consciousness is serving the universe rather than serving just this one tiny limited part of it. So that's another way of approaching an Atman, is looking at how we're just part of this great system of the planet, the universe, the society we live in, etc., etc. Okay, that's a few approaches. I'll give you one now that is not in the Bodhicharya Avatar, because I was trained in biology, and there's one reflection that might work for you, but it works for me, so I'm going to tell it to you. I reflect that I have no control or knowledge of what is going on in my body. So my organs are getting on with it, hopefully. Sometimes not very, I'm getting a bit old, so sometimes I don't do it very well. But my heart is getting on with it, my liver is getting on with it, my kidneys are getting on with it. And they do that without me paying any attention to it or knowing anything about it. And it's a good job too, because if I had to control what my heart does or what my kidney, it would be far too complicated for my little conscious mind. There's something much bigger going on here that's doing all this. So my organs get on with it, and it's a good job I don't have to think about it. They just do it. And each cell in my body, in those organs, if you know anything about biology, you know that each cell is this really complicated little factory. Amazingly complicated if you look at it under an electron microscope. And each cell is a complicated factory getting on with its own business. And if I were to try to control what's going on in one of my cells, it would be too complicated for me. I couldn't possibly do it. The universe, I'm not doing my body. The universe is doing my body. The universe is doing my body, and my conscious mind, conscious awareness is just this sort of little spark riding on top of this thing, whatever it is, this mysterious thing. The universe is doing me. And when I sit in the Metta Bhavana, I reflect sometimes I'm not breathing because I don't know what's going on. I don't know what muscles I'm using. I don't know what my cells are doing. The universe is breathing me. The atmosphere is breathing me. And the universe is also breathing all the other people in the room. So we're all interconnected as parts of this great, whatever it is, that transcends us all. And in this way, for me, the mindfulness of breathing can naturally turn into an insight practice. What I feel is an insight practice and a practice of loving kindness. Because it brings on a feeling of profound solidarity with all the other people who are breathing and are part of this just as much as me. Okay, so I hope I've made it clear that Buddhist wisdom teachings do not really mean that we don't have a self. I've hammered on about that enough, but they certainly mean we don't have the. They certainly mean don't have the sort of self we normally think we do. In a way, we don't have a self, and in a way, we do have a self. So I got a little bit of an inkling of this sort of the complexity or the paradox of this from reading a book called The Roots of Coincidence by Arthur Koestler. Now, I'm not suggesting Arthur Koestler is the Buddha's equal, but for me, it was quite a bit of an eye-opener. So he uses the analogy of the Roman god Janus. So Janus was a Roman god who had two faces that looked in different directions. And he says that all things exist like this. All things have a sort of independent existence in their own right, but also all things don't, because they're also part of larger systems. So in that sense, they don't have an independent existence. They both have a self and they don't have a self. And he coins this phrase, this rather ugly phrase, Janus-faced holons, to describe everything, basically. So holon, I take it to mean something that has a sort of a self, but is sort of a whole, but also doesn't. So just to sort of illustrate that, we could imagine an organ in the body. I mean, I've been talking about organs. Say your heart, preferably not mine. It has a sort of independent existence. It gets on with being a heart without you ever knowing anything about it. Good job too. Doing its incredibly complicated thing. So it has its own existence in that sense. And lots more, you can take it out. Well, hopefully not in your case, but a heart can be taken out and transplanted into somebody else, and it carries on. Presumably it can be put in a liquid and it'll carry on. It's got a sort of independent existence where it gets on with being a heart, irrespective of what's going on around it, if it can. But your heart is also part of something bigger, you. And it serves that bigger system that is you. When an organ doesn't serve the bigger system, it becomes cancerous and not a good thing. So it's profoundly affected by the bigger system that is you. If you run, your heart will speed up. If you die, it dies. It's kept in existence by the conditions that our body provides. And according to Koestler, we are like this. We are like that. We have a sort of independent existence. I'm different from you. I've got my own unique characteristics. You've got yours. We get on with doing our thing. But we are both part of something much larger. We're all part of something much larger, which keeps us in existence. Something much larger and more important than us, which keeps us in existence. And if we saw this, our natural response would be to serve this something bigger, rather than being a sort of cancerous organ that just serves its own ends. So, well, one thing to say about that is convincing or unconvincing. How am I doing for time? I've got no idea. I've got no clock here. Nearly 10 past. Oh, I forget all of that. Convincing or unconvincing, very briefly, all these arguments depend on words and logic, but the Buddha himself said that his wisdom teachings went beyond words and logic. So an Atman, as the absence of any unchanging self, is an inevitable outcome of the Buddha's teaching of Praticca Samutpada, conditioned co-production, which points towards the interdependence of all phenomena, so they can't have their own essence. Nothing has anything like an Atman. And this mutual interdependence of all things is pretty easy to see intellectually, actually. I think we've looked at some of the arguments. But in the Pali Canon, the Buddha tells his cousin, his cousin Ananda says to the Buddha, this conditioned co-production, which implies I'm that man, seems to me pretty clear. It's pretty easy. Got it. To which the Buddha replies, say not so, Ananda, say not so. This conditioned co-production is deep, beyond words and logic, and it's only those with some degree of transcendent wisdom who can tell you what it is, who appreciate it. So if you think you understand it, you got it wrong, basically. So the logical arguments might be helpful, but it's pointing at something bigger. It's pointing at something bigger. And I think it's pointing at, so all those arguments are almost about how there are loads of separate things, but they all interact. And I think the real teaching is getting at the idea there are no separate things at all. There's just this seamless whole in which everything mutually arises together. And one analogy for that that's often used is the dream. So none of the appearances in a dream have a separate existence. You can't, if you see a horse in a dream, you can't cut it out and have it the next day in a different reality. It's a totally part of the dream. It co-arises with the rest of the dream, and the dream co-arises with the mind of the dreamer. They can't be separate. A more modern analogy that's sometimes used is the virtual reality, like in the Matrix. The things in a virtual reality can't be sort of carved out and taken as separate things. They just all arise together as part of a virtual world. So something like that, maybe, I think, is what we're getting at. A much more mystical vision of the world arising as this wonder, this wondrous dream, this wondrous illusion, this wondrous, whatever it is. So, I mean, good company saying this. I mean, the commentator Buddha Ghosha in the 4th century was really important, tells us things arise as a togetherness, states arise together and simultaneously, not piecemeal and successively. Well, which might not be totally obvious, but I think it's getting at the same thing. Having this vision is all very well. To finish off, but to really put Shantideva's approach into action, it needs to transform into an attitude. It needs to inform our attitude, and that attitude has to affect how we live our life. So traditionally, the attitude that falls out from the bodhicitta falls out from the realization of emptiness or non-self is the bodhicitta, the desire to serve other beings as much as we serve ourselves, because we see that we are not different from other beings. So just about every time Shantideva argues for an Atman, he finishes by talking about why that means we should serve others. So he says, just as I love and cherish my body, which is divided into many limbs, so I should love and cherish this whole world, which is divided into many beings. Sangharakshita talks about finding emotional equivalence. Our emotions have to be affected by the vision. It's not enough for it just to be up here. So how do we do that? Well, we do a lot to work on our emotions, but one thing I'd really recommend as a wisdom practice as well as an emotional practice that sort of links the two is the practice that we do on the one of the intermediate course, which is the practice of recognition of benefits received. If we just list all the benefits we've received, all the benefits that have created the person we are now and that keep us in existence, we realize, a bit like this lectern, that it's infinite. It just carries on and on. And if we're emotionally healthy, our sort of emotional response to that is to want to be part of that web of benefit, to be giving back. It's only teenagers that take and don't give back sometimes. I did anyway, without any gratitude. So it doesn't necessarily imply gratitude, but gratitude and a desire to give back is an essential aspect. And it involves seeing ourselves as part of this web of interrelationships and conditions that keep us in existence. So it's both an insight practice, I think, and the emotion of gratitude is just a completely liberating emotion. It just really leads on to to action, to actually putting it into action, doing things. But even that could be so general and vague as to be meaningless. We need to actually have ways of putting it into action, And there's a teaching that sort of drops out of Shantideva's text called the mind training tradition, where it says, well, if you want to do that, if you want to encourage that attitude and that vision, this is what to do in every situation of your life, in every difficulty, with every person you meet. So it makes it really, really down to earth. This is the action aspect, where the vision turns into the attitude, but the attitude turns into this is what I do. And we might be exploring that in the next series. This is a bit of a plug. The mind training tradition and how we put that vision and that attitude into action in every moment, well, every interaction, every circumstance of our daily life. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you